Good evening again. My name is Tomáš Etzler. You know, I'm an old guy. I have been working for television forever and ever and ever. Actually, I've been working for television for so long. So when I started here in Ostrava as a dramaturg of music programs in 1988, the news in Ostrava studio were still shot on 16mm camera and or film. It was edited, you know, on a flatbed, as a film. Then I went through kind of a videotape revolution when film was replaced by videotapes. Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, that one was a little bit behind the world, I would say 5 to 10 years in these changes. But it caught up quickly, and when I joined CNN in 1999, we were still shooting on video tapes. Then I went through another revolution, which was digitizing. No more tapes, it's digital files. And now it's moving again to completely a different dimension. It's still digital, but we are talking 4K, we are talking HD, we are talking new technologies. I'm extremely excited to introduce our next guest, who we had a little chat together. His name is Ben C. Solomon. He's a New York Times journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner. For those who don't know who Pulitzer Prize is, imagine it's basically what Oscar means to actors. Pulitzer Prize means to journalists working for print media. He won his Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on Ebola virus in Liberia and Sierra Leone in 2015. He then started, I consider Ben, basically a new generation of journalists, like a new special forces of real hardcore frontline journalism. There is a new term in journalism, video journalism, it's called virtual reality. Many of you know that term from video games, but not as a journalistic term, and Ben is here to talk to us about it. He used this method or this thing, for example, in Fallujah, in Iraq, during the liberation of Fallujah by Iraqi forces. Last week, he was in jungles of Latin America. He's here today with us to share what is virtual reality in journalism and share his experiences. Please help me to welcome Ben C. Solomon.
Hi. Hey. Hi. Thank you very much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. My name, you've heard, is Ben C. Solomon. Today I'm going to talk to you about my last few projects, which are virtual reality films and short documentary filmmaking. Now, I'm a journalist for the New York Times, as you said, but a big part of what we're trying to do at the New York Times, as with everywhere, is try to say, okay, what is the new ways that we can have people understand stories around the world? And a big part of that is to understand is to look back and see how how different mediums have progressed over the years. So this is a picture of the Crimean Civil War in 1855. It's by a guy named Roger Fenton. This was the first war photographer. He took a slew of different photos throughout this war. A lot of the history says a lot of these photos were kind of set up and staged, which wouldn't be surprising now. But a lot of these photos kind of stand as like the first things that we understood war as. I mean, before this had come out, there had been no images of what war looked like, or what war seemed like, and they published this in the British papers, and this gave a whole new understanding of the dimension. Now, to do this, it took this, the photographic van. Can you imagine taking this thing around like the front lines of a war zone? They had to haul around all these things, they had to set up the shots, hold it for seconds and seconds, and it was slow and it was painful. A lot of people looked at the photos and were a little bit offended. They said, why should we show this? This is a different part of war. And now, since 1855, now we have photos like this. This is in Syria in 2012. This is a Pulitzer Prize winning photo by Javier Manzano. And as you can see, he took this with a tiny little camera, as big as that, these tiny little things. Now it's just as easy to kind of do. And so the images of war have changed. And the medium has progressed in a way so that we kind of expect photos like this instead of photos like van photos. So what that with that, I think what I want to talk about is my role as a conflict journalist and how I do it with virtual reality. Now, as he said, for those of you that know virtual reality, it's probably through video games or different films that you've seen in the headset. What I try to do is use it as a tool, as a journalistic tool, to get a new understanding of both conflict zones, places that are war-torn or have seen war before, so that people can get a deeper or more intimate understanding of that place and the people living in it. The first film we made, I'm gonna run through a few of these films and kind of the experiences of them, just to give you an idea. The first film we made was called The Displaced. This was a 12-minute VR documentary that followed 3 children throughout different war zones and tried to give an understanding of their experience in these different places. Now, in making this, it was a whole process of kind of a lot of different things come together. These 3 kids, we'd all film them in their each home countries. Shaul was in South Sudan. This is Oleg in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. And then Hannah, who was at a refugee camp in Lebanon, who was a Syrian refugee. And all these kids, we tried to tell the story of their lives from their perspective so you could have a kind of intimate understanding. We released it on these cardboard boxes that we sent out. We sent out 1.2 million of these with the Sunday paper. So all around the country in America, you got these little cardboard things that you could put your iPhone in and watch it as you go. So if you got the Sunday paper, you could watch our film and kind of have a new understanding of a VR. And this was the first time that people had ever seen VR. This was the first time that most people had ever had any connection or any understanding of what this thing was. So for us, it was a way to onboard people into what VR is in a way that's both important in news and kind of important to the world. It was a big thing for us. A lot of people liked it. We got a lot of cool press about it. We got a lot of big looks, and we got 1.2 million people that kind of got their eyes on it. We were really proud of this film. So to make VR, this was what it looked like. It is basically, for those of you that know what a GoPro is, a small little camera that takes 4K video. It's 8 of those in a circle. And you just stick them together, and you plug them into different things, and you modify them with these kind of simple lenses. And then you put in a huge battery on the bottom to power it, exterior audio that you have to have a whole different person run. It overheats, it breaks down, it barely works. And much like that photographic van, it is a complete pain in the ass. It is just a horrible nightmare to tag this thing around in these places that are already hard to function in. But for us, this is what it took. This is the requirement of this medium right now. You need to be patient. You need to kind of put it in the moment, and you need to make sure that the thing is working and running. More than anything else, running this camera felt like being like a technician, like a janitor, than it felt like being a journalist. But it was important for making the scenes and understanding the films. So as I said, the 3 kids that we featured were Hannah in a refugee camp in Lebanon. She was 12 years old. Shaul, who was 10 years old, and he was a South Sudanese refugee or displaced person in his own country. And then Oleg, who was a Ukrainian child who had been through the Eastern War. And we followed these kids each for about 5 to 6 days each and just tried to get an understanding. Now, another part of shooting this and kind of getting it was figuring out, okay, what are the best ways that we can tell these stories? What are the ways that it's going to really feel like you're there, like you're with these kids? So a big part of that came down to rigging these cameras. And what does it look like to rig these cameras up? And how does it work so that we feel like we're with these kids? So we had to come up with interesting ways to do that. This is Oleg and my co-director, Imran Ismail, doing a modified VR bike ride. Now this is flat, but if you watch it in the headset, you can look all around like that. Now shots like this were really important to us because we thought that they would have a really good effect on the way that you understood these kids and understood the natural life that they lived. And things like this were important to find the scenes that were the most compelling for a VR place. The one that worked the best is here in South Sudan when we followed a food drop. For those that don't know, a food drop is when people live in a place of the country that's so remote and so far removed and so isolated by war, that they can't get food any other way than by a plane dropping like packets of food in an open field. So we decided, okay, we want to do a VR viewing of this and what it looks like. So what we did to do that was find out the different places that the camera would push. I'm going to show you a scene here. Check it out. So what was important to us here, and what we wanted to convey with this scene, was to really put the viewer in that place, so that when they heard the plane, they would look up. When they looked up, that's when the packets would fall. And as soon as they were on the ground, they would see the people running out, going to collect them. This, to me, this scene is my favorite scene that I've shot in VR, because it really, it's the best use of the medium, both with the sound, with the blocking, the way that you move your head and look, and just the experience of going through this whole thing. This, to me, is the kind of shot that justifies VR at a journalistic context. Now, making VR, like I said, is very difficult, and a big part of it is the directors removing themselves from the scene. So what you see here is what is common in most VR films where you don't see the filmmaker, which is they're probably hiding somewhere. Throughout our time in Ukraine, in South Sudan, in Lebanon, we had to not only shoot and place the camera in the right place, but then run away and hide so that the scene could unfold around it without us there. For any of you who are directors who are making films who know, it is very hard to direct a scene. It is even harder to direct a scene when you're not in the room and you're hiding away from it. So a big part of this was experimenting and kind of running out and seeing how it goes. And this was a conscious decision because we didn't want to be in it. We wanted it to feel and look like a film where you were with these kids. So hiding sometimes could look kind of ridiculous and silly. This is in South Sudan. People getting food. This is my James Bond move. And then these guys had a good time laughing at us. So as you can see, it's not always pretty to make these things. And as you can see, we just had to hide there for 20 minutes until something happened around us. And these guys got a good laugh out of it. So when the film came out, 1.2 million people had the headsets. We had over 20 million views in just a weekend, and it was a really great success. We were nominated for an Emmy. We had a whole new slew of people understand the medium and understand its kind of effects. This was a big moment for us and a big moment for this film. Now, after this film, we said, okay, what's next? And what we said was next was, let's take this camera and this medium to war, to the front lines of war. If The Displaced showed the effects of war, then we wanted a film that shows what war looks and feels like right up close. And what happened then was the fight for Fallujah. In this film, I went on a 1-month embed with the Iraqi forces as they fought to retake the city of Fallujah from ISIS in 2016. And it was shot entirely in VR by me and just a couple close people. Me and a fixer mostly traveled around with these men, lived with them, ate with them, and experienced all the frontline battlefield stuff that they did. This is when we had incoming fire shooting at us, and the Iraqi soldiers had to back us up here to get us out from ISIS. So this film, much different from the first film, was directly on the front lines with these fighters, watching them push and take the ground. And throughout the film, you can see me in the shot. Unlike the Displaced, we decided, okay, let's not try to hide. Let's not try to pull me out. Let's show exactly what a reporter does when reporting in a war zone. So this film was a much bigger heave and a much bigger challenge for us. More than the Displaced, because this is war, and this is complicated just to work alone, and it's even made more complicated by doing it with a camera like this. So you saw that other camera, and it had 8 little GoPros tied around it. This one was one that we took 3 months to build out. This is also GoPros, but we had to modify the technology to make an entire new one with just 4 cameras so that it could be faster, more manageable, and I could move around faster with it and smarter with it when I was in these front lines. So a big part of this medium and how to do it is figuring out the technology that works best. Now, unlike films, unlike writing, there hasn't been things that come before this stuff. So each time you're doing this, you are writing the book. You are progressing the medium as you go. And this was the first time that anyone had taken one of these cameras and this medium into a war zone directly on the front lines. So what it took was a team of people to figure out what the technology would be to work with that. What we came up with was this, which by no means was less painful than the other camera, but it worked to the point where we could do it in this really challenging environment. Now, a big part of it, I don't know if you guys have seen like Hollywood movies when they have the clapper, like take one, like clap, you know, one of those things. So instead of having that, because I couldn't take it with me, I just had to snap my fingers like this. And this Iraqi guy really liked that. And all around was just kind of trying to figure out different ways to kind of put the shots together like that. And then at night, on top of working in these war zones, on top of shooting in these really challenging places, exhausting yourself and working in extreme heat, each day was 45 degrees outside, or even more sometimes. You would have to then come back and then download all these cards, clean these cameras, and kind of put together everything so it was well organized. Because the biggest challenge in VR is not just shooting it, it's also editing it and making sure that everything is manageable and put together. I traveled there for 4 weeks that I was embedded with these guys. I was me and my fixer, translator, who's named Muattez Majid Mohammed, and we traveled together with these guys, and really what we hoped to do with them and what we hoped to kind of understand was to not just be around them and not just see their lives, but to really, really get to live with them and really, really understand what their lives were like. And to do that, we needed to really embed with them and really get to know them. So we stayed there. We were with these guys as they pushed in the most dangerous and the most complicated situations. And by doing that, we would earn their trust, we would earn their respect, and they would see that we weren't there just to kind of take stuff and leave, but we really wanted to get to know them. And in doing that, there was a lot of really dangerous moments like these. Now with VR cameras, they work best when they're not moving around. Sometimes you would worry about them falling off. And I would feel very grateful when they weren't and kiss them. So as we kind of went, we would see different kind of horrors that they would see. In the aftermath of the fighting, we came to places like this, which was an ISIS prison where they held different prisoners in these tiny little cages. And this was an important moment for us for VR because it was an experience unlike any other. You got to go around this room and see this place where these soldiers, or these ISIS militants would hold different Iraqi soldiers and capturees and put them in these tiny little cages and kind of hold them there against their will and in very terrible situations. In virtual reality, it was really important for us to show this experience and show what it looked like and felt like. And we felt like in this medium, it had a really good opportunity for people to really see and feel the different ways that these places were held. So in the end, this also came out as a big piece. We released it with the magazine. We had written a 1,400-word magazine article just about the collapse of the Middle East over the past 10 years. And with it came this short film, which gave a deeper understanding of just that war and the things that went with it. So with that, these are the two big virtual reality films that I've made over the years. And as I progress and as I go, a big part of understanding war, not just through virtual reality, but is to understanding it in new ways that we can tell it outside of just the mediums that kind of limit us. So a big thing that I wanted to do this year was shift away from virtual reality and tell the story of one soldier and one man's experience in war. Unlike Fallujah, this year we have been seeing the Mosel offensive take place in Iraq. It has just ended after 9 months of fighting, and through it, like, we've seen something like, the estimates are something like 200,000 casualties in this area. And I decided in this that I wanted to make a film about one soldier, and who I found was this guy named Major Sajjad, and that's the name of the film. Major Sajjad is a 33-year-old major in the Iraqi forces. When I met him, he was in charge of 150 men. He had been shot 5 times over the years, and he had been fighting since he was 18 years old. And I knew that, you know, virtual reality wouldn't tell this guy's story as well as just a straight film trying to get understand this guy's life, trying to get understand how he had lived throughout these wars and how he had progressed. So instead of making virtual reality, instead of using that tool to tell this journalistic story, we decided to make a 10-minute short film. And I'm going to show you the first minute in the intro of that film now. In covering all these wars and finding the ways to tell the stories, the most important thing is not the medium or the way that we tell it, it's the stories themselves. Covering Iraq and seeing the fight there and seeing the progression of the battle, you know, this is a place that since, as Major Sajjad said, since the 1920s, there's been nothing but war. To understand the people and the experience of being in a place like that is an important part, I think, of being alive. I think that in life, war is as powerful of a force as love is. And it's important to see these stories and to see these people and bring people in to see them in new ways, such as virtual reality, such as films like these, so that we can get a deeper understanding of not just these places and these people like Major Sajjad, but also what it takes to build these people and for their lives to get put in the positions that they're in. In the end, we were with Major Sajjad. This is me on top of a Humvee. I just put that up there to look cool for you guys. we were with these guys for 3 weeks, embedded with them as well, living with them, working with them. And Major Sajjad just finished the fighting inside Mosel. Here's another one, sorry. And what we found in that time with them, these guys, they want the same things that we all do. They want peace, they want security, they want good education for their kids, they want to have decent lives where they can go home to their families and children. And my hope with the pieces like this and the work like this that I do is that watching this and seeing these people in these situations will make you understand that we're all alike in that sense, and that by seeing that, hopefully we can get a deeper understanding of what these wars are and maybe put an end to them. So thank you very much. We're going to take some questions now and have a little talk. I appreciate you guys coming out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great stuff, thank you very much, and congratulations on this. You know, when I found out I will be on the stage with Ben C. Solomon, I got very excited for many reasons, and one of them is that I was in Fallujah reporting for CNN for a couple months in 2004. It was not the Iraqi forces liberating Fallujah, it was the US Marines liberating Fallujah. And I was with the Marines in April of 2004. They did not succeed at that time, then they came back with vengeance a few months later and destroyed Fallujah and yes, liberated it. And although the technology we had was completely different, you know, it's not that long time ago, it's 13 years ago. We had two types of cameras, you know, one small mini DV camera, one big beta camera, completely different what Ben is using. The war reporting, I believe, remained the same, and we would like to actually, you know, I was thinking actually talking maybe a little bit about the technical aspects of it, but I think it's boring compared to what I'm sure Ben has to say about, you know, being in a war zone, coping with the war zone and reporting on the war zone. And he a little bit mentioned that the importance of the reporting, you know, people, I'm sure that people ask him many times as they ask me, you know, why do you do that? I mean, well, I usually say somebody has to do it, because these are eyewitness accounts which one day will be part of history books, which explain to the world, you know, what's happening in Iraq. It shows the suffering of the local civil, local civil populations. So I have to ask you, I'm sure we've done it before, why do you do this? You know, why do you go to these places, and why are you, as I'm absolutely 100% sure, are willing to return there?
Yeah, I think that, you know, for me, in my experience, some of the most amazing stories happen in times of conflict, because people's, not of the pain or the war or the suffering, but the hope that has to rise up for these people. In war zones around the world, you find that people aren't just living and crying all day in just the most horrible situations. They have to find ways to live their lives. They have to find ways to get food for their kids. They have to find ways to experience this thing and not go crazy. And in those moments and in these places, you find what I think is the most amazing amounts of hope and the most amazing amounts of resilience in the world. So for me, I think those stories are really important. I've been doing this long enough and have experienced enough of these to know that those stories are the things that I want to communicate with the world. And if people, the most important work for me is being able to get these things out so that people can see just that people in these places, they aren't foreign, they aren't crazy different. They want the exact same things we all do. And to be able to build that bridge between different communities, the West and maybe the people in these places, is really important for me, and I think it's important work to do.
You are a journalist. You are a journalist for one of the top global news organization, the New York Times. But you're also a human being. And how do you distinguish these two? I mean, when you go in there, when you see what's happening, you see this absolutely senseless, horrible suffering of the people who you know, who are like us, who have families, who have parents, who have children. You know, they lost their parents, they lost their children. How do you cope? How do you keep that distance to keep documenting what you are supposed to document, as opposed to feel sorry for these people breaking down emotionally? How do you cope with it?
Well, I think that it's kind of you need a good balance. You need to be able to kind of move between really digging in with people and really trying to get to know them and become close so that they trust you and believe in what you're doing, but also having enough distance away so that you don't just wake up every morning crying. And it's important to kind of figure out where that lives in you. This kind of work is not for everybody. A lot of people that do this, they can't handle it, or they can't get close enough. But what I found is that if you really believe in these people's stories and you believe in what's happening, and it's important to you, it's easy to kind of figure out where that space lives. It's easy to kind of look through your camera at some of these horrible things and figure out not how this affects just my soul and the way that I see the world, but what this footage can tell other people. This is the way that I deal with it. Now, I also spend a lot of money on therapy, and you know, everything else.
Why is New York Times paying for it?
Yeah, I'll give you the number of my boss. You can tell him.
You know, another thing which goes with it, you know, you mentioned you spent 4 weeks or 3 weeks with Major Sajjad. Sajjad.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? Because these guys, of course, you are embedded with them. They protect you. They feed you. How do you keep the distance between? You know, it's not the emotional distance you feel towards the victims of the war, civilian victims of the wars, but you know, how do you keep distance? You know, to remain your editorial objectivity and independence. You know, not to be too emotionally attached to these guys or thankful to them. How do you do that?
Yeah. Well, Sajjad was a really special case for me because I could just tell as soon as I met him that he was the guy that I was looking for. He was 33. He had 8 kids already with 2 different wives. It's encouraged in Iraq, in the Shia community that he's in. And this is a guy that when I met him, you could just tell that, you know, he was a tough guy and he was serious, and, you know, that was everywhere in Iraq. That's not hard to find. But more than that, I could tell that he was funny. And when I first met him, he cooked us, he's a very hospitable guy, and most Iraqis are. He cooked us a big, we were in the center of Mosul. We had pushed in about, in the first days of the Western offensive as far as you could push forward. And they had a forward operating base that was about maybe just half a mile or so away from the river, the Tigris River that splits the city. And he cooked this big fish dinner, and we kind of stopped and we said, wait, where did you get all these fish? And he was like, oh, we took a grenade and we threw it in the river, and we just swooped up all the fish and cooked them. And I was like, wow, that is genius, I guess, in
wartime, war zone fishing.
In a war zone, yeah, I guess that's the way to do it. And in kind of getting to know him and hearing these little stories and hearing about his family and hearing about his kids, I just knew that he really was not just a soldier, he was a person. And that's the kind of story that I wanted to tell. Now, your question was, how do I kind of keep enough distance from a guy like that so that I'm not kind of putting him on the pedestal and not kind of showing him as this great hero, but also just showing him as a flawed and kind of complex man. And the reality is that it's all about just kind of striking that balance and knowing your place. I mean, in no time can you let yourself just become one of these soldiers. Just think that you're just a part of this team. You can live with them, you can be with them, but you really need to be able to separate your mission from theirs. And mine was to tell this story and to be able to separate out this man from this entire force, which I think is the way that a lot of the world looks at it. And in doing that and kind of keeping that mission intact and kind of keeping your eyes on the thing that you want to make from it, it's a lot easier to kind of strike that balance. But it's hard. It's not always easy.
And, you know, from my experience, not everybody can actually keep that balance. You know, there were reporters in the history, you know, last 10, 15 years who were embedded mostly with the US soldiers who actually turned from reporters to cheerleaders. I still want to stick with this, you know, this embedding thing. You know, we were discussing it yesterday a little bit that, you know, the embedding with US military kind of disappeared, but it was a thing that I think, revolutionized, in a sense, the war reporting in 2000 to 2003, when U.S. military actually invited media to stay with them and to kind of be part, accommodated and move around with the combat troops, be it Marines, be it different militaries. And there was a lot of people, mostly in academia actually, who kind of criticized that, that this is too close, that this is unethical, and it's basically that if somebody as journalist in bed with the U.S. With any military, that it's kind of indebted to that military, and it's supposed to report positively because they protect him, because they feed him and what have you. But I personally thought it's like one of the best things that ever happened to journalism. What is your view? On embedding journalism in general, going with the army, which you depend 100% on your security and safety and the safe return, and of course they feed you, yeah. they accommodate you.
So as you were saying before, embedding journalism with the American forces has faded over the years. I have never embedded with an American force, or a Western force for that matter. My only embeds have been with in Iraq, Iraqi security services, in Afghanistan, Afghan services. And in those wars, the sides are very clear, In Iraq, it is Iraq versus ISIS. You cannot get embeds with ISIS. In Afghanistan, it is the Afghan fighting forces versus Taliban. You cannot get embeds with the Taliban. At least I can't. And in these situations, it's very clear that there's only one way to do it. Now, what you're talking about with the American forces, I think it does raise an ethical issue, because you are living with these guys, you're working with them, you're around them, and sometimes the enemy is maybe one that your country doesn't approve of, but maybe one that's important to humanize all the same. And the reality is that I think covering war is important, and it's important to kind of see these stories and for it to come out. And in doing so, I think that you need to be able to kind of cover both sides as best you can. When you're covering ISIS versus Iraq, you can only really cover one side with as much depth. And to mirror that is impossible. The hope would be is to use that platform and use a place like that to get better access to what ISIS is left behind, to the way that they operate, the way that they kind of put their work together. But it's not always easy. And I think it's really complicated when you mix in the different factors of living with these guys, eating with these guys. I mean, with these Iraqi guys that we lived with, we brought our own food. It was really important for us that we wouldn't take their food. We wouldn't take rations that would be otherwise meant for soldiers. We wouldn't be any load more than what they would take for their own guys. We slept in their rooms, but we brought our own beds. We brought our own kind of sleeping gear. It was important for us to have the simple things be independent, so that we could at least feel and move around in different circles than them and spend our own independent money instead of using theirs.
Nothing, what I've done in my work life, nothing compares to war reporting. Absolutely nothing. It's exhausting. It's rewarding. Sir Winston Churchill once said that the most exciting thing in life is if somebody shoots at you and misses. And it's a massive adrenaline trip. It's something. It's non-stop tension. How do you deal with that stress? How do you deal? There is very few moments you can get, you can rest in a war zone. But if you have that moment, how do you deal with it? Is it, how do you diffuse that stress? Is it friendship, camaraderie, vodka? What is it?
It's vodka. No, it's not vodka. For me at least, spending times in these places and kind of extended times, it's a capricious rhythm. Sorry to the translator, that is a hard word. It's a roller coaster. Sometimes war is, you're in these insane moments and you just are amazed that you're alive and amazed that these things are happening and you're seeing them. Other times you spend days just sitting in a room, smoking cigarettes, playing on your phone, whatever you can do. And in times like that, that's when I think is more challenging than the times when it's just this insanity all around, because that is why you go. That's when you're capturing what you need. The boring times are when you kind of that's when your head kind of does more math. That's when the world kind of makes a little less sense. Now, I've always found that being around good teams, good people around you, having a good translator with you, people that you trust. For the New York Times, we travel with a security attaché, which is like a guy that comes with the kind of as a field medic and kind of an advisor. We have a driver, so it's a small team. And for me, I always grow really close with my team. It's important for me to have like a lot of trust there and kind of move with these guys so that we're all together and we're all on the same page. And as the director and as the boss, you're also managing these guys. So it's important to kind of keep busy in these places when it's slow, and then when things are really moving fast, it's important to kind of be able to keep your head on straight. But I mean, it's probably a lot different experience for you in Fallujah in 2004, because that was, I mean, that's one of the great battles in American recent history. So it just, each war is different, you know.
But one thing is not different. You perhaps told me that, I'm sorry, I forgot. Where do you live? What is home? What do you call home? A city.
So right now I live
a state.
I live in New York, but I'm moving to Bangkok to be the Southeast Asia correspondent.
But until now you live in New York?
New York City.
All right, New York City.
Great city.
What happens to your head? What happens in your mind when you spend 3, 4 weeks, 5 weeks in a war zone in Iraq? When you see these crying women, when you every day you witness suffering that it's unspeakable. What happens to a person when after the day after New York City?
You know, for me, it's always been kind of easy to separate these two minds, and it's not for everybody. And maybe later in life that won't be the case. But for me, it's very important for me to, while I'm seeing these horrible things and while I'm experiencing these places, to understand the limitations of myself. This is a job. This is something that I'm doing for work so that people can see, so that other people can get an understanding of this. It's never been hard for me to kind of fly back to New York and switch back into, you know, filing my expenses, going to a bar in Brooklyn and like being with friends. Now it's important to do the things so that you have, what's the word? You have a routine. For me, it's exercise. Sometimes I meditate. I see a good psychologist that is really important to me. Doing these things and kind of keeping track of yourself and keeping self-care is really as important in this job as kind of going to these places and doing these dangerous things.
Do you need some time to adjust, or are you functioning normally from the, you know, you land in New York and it's like you have never been to Iraq?
No, it's definitely a change. I mean, I think whenever you go from one place and you've been there for a long time and it has a certain amount of intensity and you come back to another, there's definitely a shift that takes place and you need to kind of be conscious of that. But for me, I've always been good at kind of figuring out the right places to go to and having the right time to kind of decompress and take care.
You know, I'm using Iraq, but you know, I'm sure that Ukraine or Southern Sudan wasn't much more prettier. Do you know, like, okay, so you are in Iraq, you see all these things, and then you come and you go to a bar, to a New York bar, and you spend a few hundred, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, $100 in a couple of hours. Have you ever felt guilty? You know, like, how do I deserve this? You know, how you know, what happens? You know, like, how come these people have to live like this? And I have this opportunity now to go and have, you know, have fun with my friends and watch football game and what have you. Have you feel guilty, or have you feel any?
Yes and no. I mean, the reality is that I try not to feel guilty. I try to feel grateful. I try to feel very grateful for the position that I'm in, for the world that I live in, for the good life that I've been given. I mean, if you were born in the West compared to somebody who's born in Mosel these days, you win the lottery just in being born in that place. I try to take that understanding into these places. And I try to make it more about, you know, look at what I've got and look at the things that I've been blessed to be able to do and the stories that I can tell. That's the way that I can kind of make sense of it and try to put it together in my mind.
I know it's a fairly short career, you know, very successful, however successful. Do you feel Ben C. Solomon different of 2013, 2012 different than Ben C. Solomon of 2017, and how?
Yeah. So I'm 29 years old, and it wasn't very long ago that I was an asshole young kid. I mean, I might still be. I don't know. I can say that over the years I've lived in so many different places, and I've kind of been based in Cairo and Istanbul and in Nairobi. I lived for a short time in Paris. I spent time in Nigeria. All these places that kind of like give you different understandings of how you can operate in the world and how you can kind of be better at working in different parts in the world and understanding different people in them. So yes, I mean, I think 2012 Ben was a little bit of an asshole.
Listen, thank you very much for the honesty. I give it a first, and I know it may not be the easiest thing to open up like this and be honest like this. Again, much appreciated. I want to give the chance to the audience now. If anybody has any questions for Ben regarding his work and his time in war zones and places like, I've got one more question. You know, you've been to Iraq, you've been to other war zones, but you also cover Ebola. I remember when I was in Beijing, the correspondent who was there for CNN, Mackenzie, he was covering Ebola, and he came back, and the day he came back, the entire CNN Beijing bureau called in sick. Nobody wanted to come back. What was scarier, to be working in such a high, dangerous area like Ebola-stricken areas, or what was more depressing, stressful for you, or scary?
If you'd like to know that, you can come to the second talk tomorrow at 4:45 p.m. right here. We'll see you all there. Just kidding. For me, they both have different challenges and different kind of problems, but Ebola was definitely more stressful at night when you went down to go to sleep, because you had to think like, oh God, did I touch anything? Oh, did I slip my arm and kind of touch that sick guy? It was much more about later on, were you gonna get the disease or not? But we can talk more about that tomorrow.
Okay, anybody in the audience has any questions?
Please, nothing more about my personal life, please.
Thank you. Two questions, Ben.
I'm sorry, you're a public figure.
The first has maybe have a yes or no answer. Have you ever been approached by any intelligence agencies?
No.
Okay, there you go. And the second one is how do you...
Too many tattoos, you know. I don't like that.
The second one is how do you foresee your Bangkok, Southeast Asia position quite different from what you've done in the past?
I mean, it's different and it's similar. So working in Bangkok and covering Southeast Asia is in terms of political stability, it's a lot different than a place like Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and parts of East and Western Africa. But at the same time, a big thing for me and what I try to do in all my pieces is the same, which is to narrow down on people and the lives that they're living in certain situations. It doesn't always have to be war. It doesn't always have to be conflict. I think that people live amazing lives and do amazing things and find amazing moments of hope in most situations. So the hope for me in a place like that is to kind of take a step back from conflict, take a step back from war, and maybe not. Maybe these places, I mean, if you look at southern Philippines already, and the cities as well in Manila, they already have different conflicts kind of brewing, but it'll be important for me to have a new beat and to have a focus in a part of the world and not just kind of bounce to different places.
Hello, thank you for the impressive talk and a very interesting work that you're doing. I was just curious how it all started with the VR for New York Times. Like, did you start doing videos and then you pitch it to the editor of New York Times, like this is the next big thing that we should be doing, or? Oh, no.
I was adamantly against virtual reality. They asked me to do it. We, as an organization, decided that we wanted to kind of explore this medium and understand what it was going to do for storytelling. And in doing that and kind of starting it, they tried to figure out how we could do it, because we didn't know how to make VR. Nobody knew how to make VR. This was late 2014, early 2015. So to figure out that, they said, okay, we can hire a company and work with a production company that's doing it, but we needed to be and feel like the New York Times, so we needed to co-partner with a New York Times journalist. And I was a good choice because I make films and I'm a filmmaker and I'm also a reporter. So to add the VR thing was an obvious step for my bosses. For me, I was so against it. I really didn't want to do it. I was like, I make videos, man. I don't want to do that shit. Like, that's so lame. It wasn't until I saw the budget. No, just kidding. It wasn't until it wasn't until that I kind of got to watch a lot of the films and got to see what it could do that really sparked my interest. The coolest thing about making VR films is, like I said, like no one has done most of the things before. Now people have done a lot of things, but back then no one had done all these things, and being able to try different shots and try different ways of doing it, and use it as a new opportunity to tell these stories was really interesting to me. So that's how I got won over.
I just wonder about how getting embedded works, because I suppose you've been in so many places that you don't always speak the language or already have a network in place. Is it something the New York Times does, or do you have to do it yourself? And how do you do that? Because I suppose it needs a lot of trust in you, your team, your background for people to take you along.
Sure. So embedding with forces it's more than anything, it's bureaucratic. It's about filling out the papers and applying to the right people and asking the right questions high on the chain in places like Washington or Baghdad, where generals and senators and commanders sit and make decisions. Once those decisions are made, then they get trickled down to the forces on the ground, and they say, hey, soldier, you are taking this journalist. And usually the soldiers are like, all right, shit, we got to take care of this guy now. So in terms of getting the embed, in terms of getting that access, it's about having the right infrastructure, which I'm very lucky to have at a place like the New York Times. But in terms of getting the access on the ground, like the real feeling from the soldiers, it's about being there and being present and showing these soldiers that you're not dead weight, that you can kind of keep up, you can kind of be with them and not be too slow or you won't slow them down. And so when you do that, and when you spend enough time kind of working that skill, then it just becomes a lot easier.
If you got opportunity to make an interview with ISIS commander, would you feel independent enough to do it fair?
It's a very good question. This is something that we thought about a lot. In covering this stuff and doing this work, a big part of going to Mosel for the first time was trying to find a way that you could talk to ISIS soldiers. Now, the most obvious way is talking to prisoners. It's talking to ISIS prisoners that had been caught by either the Peshmerga, the Kurdish forces, or the Iraqi forces themselves. And in doing that, we applied and we asked all these different prison wardens, can we please just have some time with your prisoners? And we found one prison that allowed us to do that. And in setting up the terms and looking at how it's done, what we found was that these guys were being tortured. These were prisoners that were not being held by the standards of the Geneva Convention. No, these guys were living in shit. These guys were getting beat up every day. And to put a camera on them and ask them questions didn't feel like ethically it would have a real benefits to understanding their story. Instead, it would just be a story that they've been told to tell, or they would be doing it under duress. And so for me, it was very hard to kind of come to that conclusion. I spent a lot of time thinking about whether I wanted to or whether I not wanted to be able to do that. What would be the ramifications of that? Other ways to tell those stories would be to tell them by finding the remnants of what ISIS fighters left behind. A colleague of mine has been working for months just gathering different documents and information all around Mosel just to understand the infrastructure and understand the lives of these guys, diaries, cell phone videos, all this stuff. And it's going to be a really exciting and interesting piece to understand how ISIS works. But for me, yeah, it's an important thing to cover, and it's very, very difficult. It's very hard to kind of figure out the best way to do it.
So I was just curious on the story, kind of like the process of how you build the story. Is it, when do you have the story crafted? Is it while you're out there? Is it you have a kind of a setup plan before you go out there, or is it dynamic? Kind of how that is?
Sure, yeah. It's the process is a process. It's not one way or the other. I think that for me, I like to be able to spend a bit of time on the ground in a place like Mosel before I can kind of understand what I want to do or what I want to cover. I spent about 3 weeks there just doing small stories, going around writing daily dispatches, doing like small videos before I knew that like, okay, what's the story that I don't think is being told here or that I can tell with my medium in a better way. And that was finding one man, one major, and kind of understanding him. So really it's about kind of going to a place and getting your feet and getting used to the situation and trying to understand the place. And then from there, figuring out what is the most effective thing you can do and the most interesting way you can fit it into your medium, your narrative.
Hi, your images are super powerful. They're really amazing. My question is, what was your worst nightmare in the edit room after you got all this footage?
That's a very good question. Is this being recorded? Will my editor see this? The worst, the hardest part was kind of, there's a lot. The hardest part when you're doing edits on like pieces like this is like what you leave behind, like what you want. I mean, I'm with these guys, I've lived with them, I experienced these terrible things with them, and then, you have a scene that you just film and you're like, oh, this is the scene, like I'm getting it, this explains everything, this is the most important scene of all time. And then you sit down in an edit bay in an air-conditioned room in New York, and your editor, who has not been there and has not experienced that, looks at it and they're like, nah, cut that. Dealing with things like that is really difficult, but in turn, for any journalist that knows, it's the most important part of the process, because you can get way too attached to a scene, way too attached to a moment, and then lose sight of the bigger picture and lose sight of the bigger thing that you're trying to put together. So I can't think of any one specific moment, but that's kind of a painful reality.
Thanks for being here, really exciting stuff. So how much emphasis is the New York Times putting on this genre of not just virtual reality, but also just documentaries, video in general, as opposed to written storytelling? Are you going to continue this kind of work in Southeast Asia? Thanks.
Yeah, where are you? Sorry. Okay, all right. Sorry. Yes, part of my new job will be, I'm going to be the first ever video correspondent, which will be a mixture of digital media and doing videos, and also writing stories, filing regular written reports. It's kind of an experiment to see if in this day and age it's realistic to have a digital first correspondent who does video and produces multimedia and does shooting and puts this stuff together, and also is just a regular writer and correspondent. So yeah, I think that's going to be a big part of the job and the experiment, because we're trying to figure out new ways to bring readers in and make people more engaged with different mediums. We're out of time, but I feel like you should ask. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, you were saying that you were going with army, like Iraqi army, Afghani army, which is like more black and white, because of course enemy is ISIS or Taliban. But I know you've been also working in Syria. Is there any army in Syria now which you would join as kind of embed, or would you refuse, for example, to go with Assad army, YPG or FSA, because the situation is very unclear and no army is really black and white? So what's your position in that?
So when I was working in Syria the last time I was in Syria was 2013, when the Free Syrian Army still had large control over Aleppo, and it was very easy to kind of sneak over the border and embed with them and see the fight. In doing that, you automatically exclude yourself from being able to embed with Assad forces, Assad anything, to go to Damascus at all, because they read the New York Times and they see your name and they're like, like that guy ain't coming, he's with the other team. Now, these days, in this present moment, when Syria is becoming such an important kind of part of the international relations of so many different countries, it is very hard to get into Syria safely. So many armies and groups that are the rebels there can't offer you legitimate or good protection, and so many of the price on your head as a journalist is so high that it's a huge risk to even go in. There are some people doing it. There's some people going with different Kurdish forces that are doing quick trips in the Kurdish occupied areas in the north. But I'm moving to Bangkok. I'm done. So for now, I think I'm gonna revisit that maybe in a couple of years when I am done in Southeast Asia. But I would say that I probably would not embed if I could right now.
I know we run out of time, but there is also one more hand there. I would like to give you the chance. Was there? Yes. Last question.
Thank you. I would again like to raise the question of objectivity about the interpersonal stories. So maybe, do you think they have some bigger potential? They can also tell the history of the conflict and something more than just the personal story of the people?
I think that objectivity is a fine line, and a lot of it depends on reputation of the paper, reputation of the journalist, reputation of the person. So much of these things are about trust and about kind of balancing these things. And so much about the story is about balancing the good and the bad. Telling a personal story like the one from Major Sajjad is something that I think gets kind of lost in the narrative, which is that these are real people going through this. These are real people on the ground fighting here. And the issue of the objectivity of being with them, of spending time with their families, to me is less of a threat than it is to not tell that story. So in meeting someone like that and telling their story and kind of showing the world that a face to this war, a face to the army that's fighting it, is an important part. And being able to balance that line takes experience, and it takes time, and it takes a lot of kind of emotional investment and removal from being able to do it. So I think it's important, and I don't have a magical formula for how it's done best, but as long as we keep telling these stories, as long as we keep going to these places and trying, I think that's the important thing.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you for coming out.